Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum and good evening. Thank you, I'd like to thank the Muslim Student Association for inviting me to address this topic. It's the first time I've been in Holland, and it's really good to be here to talk about a topic, and also in this kind of venue, because really this kind of topic is important for us to look at it from an academic perspective, and also to consider its wider implications. And I think you, being students and also prospective academics and researchers, are very important in dealing with a topic like this. The whole topic of media and how it affects Muslims is something that's very well documented now, as we will see. There's a lot of people who have spoken about it, a lot of research, a lot of books that have been written, and that's probably been more accelerated following the events that have happened towards the turn of the century. I want to share with you, first of all, the whole concept of how the media works in Britain, and also how its impact on Muslims will be, and then also look at some of the possible scenarios that we have with this whole topic. So if you just take a look at something like this, these are the kind of headlines. I'm just going to give you a few examples of the headlines that we have. I don't know if that's clear there, but so the kind of headlines that you will get in the media are very sensationalist, trying to attract attention and trying to provoke a certain reaction. So you see this title here, which was following a certain research that was happened, and it's like a survey about Muslims. So the title was initially Muslims Silent on Terror. So it was there to give kind of understanding, kind of perception to anybody who reads the title, that actually Muslims are complacent, they don't really care about terrorism, and therefore in one way they are either supportive of it, or by actually being silent they are condoning it. Whereas the actual thing, the actual reality of the whole article in the survey was really about that Muslims were silent on what was known as an extremist tip-off scheme. It was a totally different thing. You know, the government wanted people to basically, if you think that somebody is an extremist, so it's not a terrorist, somebody is extremist, if you think that they are showing signs of extremism, meaning they're showing signs of also this whole definition of extremism is something vague. If you feel that they are showing it, then would you report that to the government or to the police or whatever? And a lot of the Muslims said, no, we wouldn't report that, because it's not about terrorism, it's not about a threat of terrorism, and also this whole concept of extremism is vague about what is extremist and what is not. But you can see how initially, the initial title was Muslims Silent on Terror. When this was challenged by my colleague, the article, the newspaper was forced to change that to a more accurate title, which is that Muslims stay silent on extremist tip-off scheme. You can see there automatically how different those titles are. Another example is also shown here. Let me move on that one, because time is going to be short. Title here, you see Ramadan train driver in crash. Again, trying to sort of push the sort of scenario that there was a train crash, and that train crash happened because the driver was a Muslim and he was fasting, and so therefore he had that crash. But in fact, when a complaint was raised with the independent press standards about this title, and in fact there was no evidence following the investigation, there's no evidence to say that this driver, the crash was caused because the driver happened to be fasting. They ended up changing the article and writing an apology. But you see this title here on the left side, that is a big title you know, it's right there in your face. When they were forced to show an apology or actually contract, they changed it to a small section there, just to say, yeah, actually we got it wrong, and it was. So you can see again that is also a facet of how the media deals with. And then there are many other incidences. I mean, you'll see more of these. Equating people here, these two black gentlemen. One of them, has sort of extremist views, and then they just the newspaper they reported on somebody else. So they put the picture of this other person and started to talk about him, and so on. Even how they analyze polls and surveys. A big survey happened where there's a policy exchange. It's a think tank. They did a survey about Muslims, and the author of the report himself, he actually concluded that Muslims are amongst the country's most loyal, patriotic and law-abiding citizens. So this is like the author of the report. But when the tabloid newspapers tried to report on this actual study, they came up with headlines which again want to promote that kind of sensationalism. So they came up with headlines like UK Muslims show worrying belief in conspiracy theories, claims think tank. Another one said that Muslims supporting or believe that 1 in 25 Muslims believe that Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. They didn't give the full picture of actually what the statistics were showing, that actually the majority of, comparing the 4% of British Muslims, giving the answer of actually they didn't know whether it was behind it or not. So the way that they changed the whole perception of reporting the news is something that is also part of what we are seeing today. Now, there is no doubt that the media, as an actual faculty of how it conveys information, is very effective in formulating people's discourse. Amy Goodwin, she said that there's no doubt that the media has become the most powerful tool to shape public opinion. After the Watergate incident back in the US, the media was considered to be the fourth power in quote-unquote democracy, after the executive and the judiciary and the legislative. So people are affected by media coverage. They see the news, how it is framed will always determine how they actually understand and see people. And not only that, but a lot of the time the media is the main source of people's knowledge. People go to the media to find the knowledge that shapes their attitude, it shapes their ideology, and this also becomes even more critical when we're talking about minorities. Because when people try to find out about minorities, they very rarely can interact with those minorities to find out their information, so the media then becomes the more authoritative and in fact many times the sole information provider about those minorities. And we had a study back in the UK by a famous survey, online survey company called YouGov, and they showed that 74% of the British public, they claim that they know nothing or next to nothing about Islam. So 74% know nothing or next to nothing, and from those, 64% of the public, they claim that what they know about Islam is acquired through the media. So that's 2/3 of people shape their view about Islam in Britain by what they hear from the media. And if this is the kind of media headlines that you're going to get, then this is the kind of images and this is the kind of perception that the people will be shaped by their actual information and the knowledge that they think about Islam. In 2004, Archbishop Fitzgerald, who was part of, was reporting to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, he said that we are all well aware that the roots of racism, xenophobia, discrimination, and intolerance are found in ignorance and hatred, which may often arise from faulty education and also from the misuse of the media. So, and there's so many other, people who have documented this. Like I said, the actual research and body of research into talking about Muslims in the media, and especially British Muslims, is a very big one today. Lots of studies are there, and they are, they range from online articles to actual dissertations. All of this has happened, or maybe the biggest thing that happened was following a shift, following the actual 9/11, September 11th tragedy, that was a big shock to the whole of the world. It was really that kind of turning point that made people, and especially the media, to be more interested in Muslims. And that is almost like a big push in terms of how the quantity of media coverage with regards to the Muslims. There's a phenomenal increase following 2001 in the number of times that Muslims were being reported in the newspaper. I mean, back in sort of the 1980s and 90s, you'd very rarely see a news item about a Muslim or Islam. And sometimes some people would, if they saw something about Islam, Muslims would be excited, actually there is fast forward to 2001 and later on, media coverage started to become very exaggerated, and exactly we'll see some statistics about that as well. Obviously, that was related to the rise of global terrorism, but also that was also coupled with a rise in Islamophobic attacks against Muslim minorities, especially of the West. So the increase in coverage was related to that, but also the media played almost like a cyclic role into pushing more of that discussion into the forefront, which we'll see. This is just another example of how the media pushes certain information. I mean, we have in the UK Birmingham. Who's heard of Birmingham? Yeah, just one or two. Okay. Birmingham is actually the second biggest city in the UK, and it does have a lot of Muslims, but the Muslims are only 25% of the population. But in America, when there was some issue, there was some sort of Islamophobic rant in Fox News, which you mentioned earlier. The commentator said, the Birmingham has. There are cities in the UK which are 100% Muslims, and it's almost like trying to spread that kind of notion that this is a worry to think about. This even made our Prime Minister at the time laugh about this kind of reporting. And this is another one. There are worrying Sharia law zones being implemented in the UK. Again, where in fact all it was some people, some lunatics going around with a sticker and sticking it on lampposts and saying this is a Sharia zone or whatever like this. But the newspaper started to report it as if these were real zones which exist in the UK, and to a certain extent that even police don't enter these zones. This is how dangerous this whole matter is. Now, lots of research has been done, and one that was done in 2016 by Ahmed and Matthias, they analysed 345 studies in a period of 15 years, and again they showed that the media coverage tends to be negatively framed in relation to Muslims. Kabir, another author and writer, said there is a perception that media coverage of Muslims focus disproportionately on bad news and on conflicts, with less time given to other issues or contributions of Muslims into the arts, sciences, and so on. And Baker, in 2013, when he analyzed the pieces of information, the pieces of news in the media, again over a period of 11 years, he showed that for every one item, news item, or we can say every one moderate Muslim news item mentioned, there is 21 examples of extremist Muslims articles mentioned or something associated in the British press. And the research is gone. I don't want to bore you with all these statistics, but there's all those researches there. So it's really not something that is deniable now, that the actual impact of negativity that is being portrayed by the media is there, and it's well documented. Now, I don't need to tell you that negative stereotypes will have negative implications on people. This is something, again, that's documented well by psychologists who show that, you know, negative stereotyping of individuals not only affects the perception of people of those individuals, but also has an effect on the individual themselves. So an individual that already thinks that they can't achieve something with that kind of stereotype for whatever reason, then that stereotype will actually affect them to the extent that they already will be disadvantaged by this. And so by having continuous measurements and continuous mentioning of negative information about Muslims, negativity in the Muslims will have that kind of link with the effects on Muslims. And obviously one of those big effects that affects Muslims today in the West is the whole concept of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is defined as something, as unfounded hostility towards Islam. There are other definitions, but the real reality is it's about sort of an unfounded kind of reaction towards Islam and Muslims, and it is real. It does affect people, and therefore there is a need to do something about it. Now, those negative portrayals have actually, or will actually result in people reacting to those Islamophobic attitudes. So you'll find that people who are dealt with this kind of way will actually also develop some sort of mechanism to try and have a behavior towards it, and therefore we'll get this kind of continuous cycle which sometimes is very difficult to break. Also, this whole pushing of a kind of narrative that Muslims are always in the negative light creates a kind of imbalance within society, where you have an us and them kind of mentality, you have like an in-group and out-group kind of differentiation, and that again is not helpful for any society to prosper. And while we're looking at this, I think we have to think about why does the media behave in such a way? Why is the media reporting about Muslims in such a way? Why is it giving all these negative stories like I mentioned to you? Now, it could be that some people might actually say that part of the reason why the media is reporting these stories is because that these are actually things that are happening. So, you know, when the media is reporting about terrorist attacks or some sort of certain, abnormal practice, or maybe something which goes against what might be considered as a norm within Western society, then the media is just merely reporting what's happening there. And we know that the freedom of the media is a protected privilege in the democratic world. But at the same time, one can argue that even any sort of reporting, if you're reporting on crime, or if you continuously report that a certain neighborhood is full of crime, it's full of high drug dealers or high gangs or high level, that level, even though it might be an accurate reporting, that can also lead to negative perceptions. It might actually create that kind of image and the perception of people just by hearing news. And that's why when you're always hearing negativity, it automatically will lead you to change the kind of attitude that you have. There is another notion that why does the media behave like this, and some people say that, well, some aspects of the media are influenced by right-wing ideology, and that is also seen and also reported. We have, for example, back in 2005, the BNP, which is the British Nationalist Party, which doesn't exist much now, when they wanted to increase their campaign to get elected as a party, they were basically distributing leaflets with a photograph of a bomb, a blasted bus, which was the number 30. That was one of the buses that was blown up in 2005 in the 7/7 attack, terrorist attack. And they said under that is that maybe now it's time to start listening to the BNP. So we find that there is a certain tendency by media outlets to actually relate to a certain type of political ideology, and some of that is right-wing. Another reason why the media may report a lot of these negative stories is because the media is a business enterprise at the end of the day. They try to seek profitability, they want to make money, and therefore sensationalist headlines will attract sales, and more sales obviously is more revenue and so on. So the more controversial the title is, the more likely people are going to buy the newspaper or more likely to read the article. So some people might say to you, actually, it's nothing personal. It's nothing personal against Muslims. It's just that you Muslims make a good opportunity for us to increase our sales. It's a good revenue for us because we're just using you to do that. Another reason might be that media is also, like any other industry, is also prone to lobbyists, people who have agendas. And indeed, Amelia, one of the researchers, also concluded that according to some theories that media representation is strongly linked to structures of power that inform not only cultural considerations but also affect concrete power structures. And so therefore lobbyists will need conflicts, they will need some sort of polarization, they will need some sort of misinformation, and that in itself makes the media a very useful partner for people to use for the lobbyists to use, again, to further their agenda. So that's another reason why media might behave in such a way. Another reason why some people say the media is reporting all these news is that they will say, actually, it's the Muslims themselves that they are giving us these news. They're the ones who are coming up, they're the ones who are talking, they're the ones who are saying. And usually this happens when you get a Muslim, or maybe a prominent Muslim, or sometimes a Muslim who is seeking attention, and they are the ones who would actually make controversial comments, and those controversial comments are therefore kind of things which the media will report on, and those are the comments that the media will convey, and they happen to be negative that is emerging from their mouths. On the other hand, though, the media does tend to, and this is something that was challenged in 2016, we had a very infamous, notorious guy called Anjem Chowdhury in the UK. He was one of those people he was actually a solicitor, and he was a person who was very controversial. He was one of those people seeking attention, and he was one of those people who would give those comments. And so actually, whilst in the UK, certain politicians and indeed occasionally the government would be saying that the places of radicalization is happening in the mosques, and mosques are giving platforms to radical preachers, the reality was, what we said is actually it's the media that's giving the platform to these radical preachers to make their voices heard. You have someone like Versi who commented, he said, Anjem Chowdhury was a gift for our media establishment. Here was a man who seemed to have more journalists on speed dial than he had mainstream Muslims. So this was a person who, whenever there was a controversial topic, he would be the one to appear on the news, he would be the one to ask for comment, because, hey, what kind of comment is he going to give? He's going to give the controversial comment, which is in, a marginalized view amongst the Muslims, but he's the kind of one that is pushed by the media. So again, supporting that kind of agenda. And another reason why Muslims are shown in negative terms is probably because they are absent from the other side of things. So we see that there's a focus of Muslims in the negative lights, and that means that they are actually absent from more normalized, quote-unquote, normalized representations within society. Things like, soaps, things like literature, reality TV, and so on. And so because they're not within that normalized frame, they're always seen as people who are either eccentrics or people on the margin of society. They only appear when there is an issue related to these problems. But in recent years, British Muslims have also been in the forefront in terms of this normalized presentation in the UK. So we know that the Mayor of London is a Muslim. In 2016, I think, we had the Sports Personality of the Year was a Muslim footballer. We had the President of the National Union of Students was a Muslim. And even the winner of the Great British Bake Off was a Muslim as well, with her hijab. So those kind of participations were there to give, if you like, more of a balance to the kind of always negative reporting on Muslims. I'm just going to show you a little bit more about some of these manifestations of media bias before we just move on to the bigger question of impact. Now, one of the things that we see with the media is that disproportionate coverage. The Media Watch magazine, which I know this is not the UK, but it monitored the coverage of media in Denmark. And they found that even though Muslims represent 3% of the population in Denmark, they actually feature in 35% of the media news. So you can imagine that kind of disproportion. And 65% of that times that they appear in the news is in a negative way. So this is something that, again, is quite documented about how disproportionate the number of times, and I mentioned to you before the statistics of 21 negative pieces of news compared to one moderate piece of news. Secondly, we have underreporting of certain items. So what happens is the media underreports good news, we said that, but also we see that the media doesn't report as much the victims of terrorism when the majority of victims of terrorism are actually Muslims themselves. And we see when there is an attack, when there is a terrorist attack that happens in a Western city, in the UK, we hear about this in the news for days, sometimes extending to a week. But when there was a recent attack in Somalia, for example, when again hundreds of people were killed in a terrorist attack, the news hardly even featured even once. So that kind of disproportionate reporting of the news, underreporting of that, tries to feed in to that kind of narrative that actually the threat of the threat of terrorism from Muslims is actually against non-Muslims, whereas the reality of the matter is that the people who have been killed mostly by terrorism have been Muslims. Reporting something like that, like Burke, he said that in his article, that again, it is actually it's something that the Western media is guilty of. You have reporting of religious affiliation in a discriminatory fashion. Again, that is done more for Muslims. Blech, in his article, when he reviewed 11 years of British newspaper headlines, he said that Muslims are constantly portrayed more negatively than Jews and frequently more negatively than Christians. Not only that, but we can see that when the perpetrator of a certain crime is a Muslim, the newspapers will report his religion. So they'll say a Muslim man did this or a Muslim woman did that. But if it's not a Muslim, then they would not report the religion. So the religion is reported as an identity when he or she is a Muslim. So, for example, we had the recent effect of the paedophilia grooming gangs that were working within the UK. These are people who are criminals. They are people who are they are wolves. They were grooming girls or teenagers. They were looking out for them, and basically they were using their influence of drugs or alcohol or whatever to take advantage of this section of society. Now, these people were criminals. They weren't doing it because they were Muslims. They weren't doing it because Islam was telling them to do that. But the kind of headlines within the newspapers, within the articles, that these are Muslim grooming gangs. These are Muslim paedophilia rings. And so therefore you can see how that is used in a discriminatory way. That's that one there. Again, mentioning religion when it's not relevant at all. So similar to the point in number 3, but here the media sometimes tries to mention things and make an association when there's no relevance to that association. So we had an 11-year-old girl recently died. There was a school trip to a theme park, and she fell off. Something happened, fell off one of the roller coasters or whatever. So it was a safety issue. Now, the newspaper that reported that, some of the news outlets that reported that, they reported it as that this girl, this 11-year-old died, and she went to the Islamic school, which happened to have had done this and this and that, and so they started to focus on reporting about the Islamic school that she had been going to, and not the fact that this was a tragic incident that was that this girl had been affected by. You have a similar thing that happened with when we had the Finsbury Park attack as well. This was when someone who wasn't a Muslim, someone who was from the far right, who hired a van, and he went actually and drove it into Muslims. He killed one person and he injured another 11. Now, the first article that appeared on the media was that a white van plows into pedestrians in front of the mosque that was where Abu Hamza was preaching, and so the link was not about this, how bad this was, but they had to link the mosque to its roots. And Abu Hamza hasn't been there for about 7-8 years, but because he was there at one time and he is a notorious extremist figure, they reported that the mosque was where Abu Hamza, so making that association when it's not even relevant to the news. So again, that is another sort of facet of how the media reports that. There are obviously medias which are headlines which are designed to infuriate. We've got that on there which you saw before, and and there are many other titles. You know, UK mosques fundraising for terror, 1 in 5 British Muslims sympathy for jihadis, BBC puts the Muslims before you, halal secret of Pizza Express, Muslim vote could decide 25% of seats, and lots of other sort of sensational. The whole idea of these articles are just to infuriate you, but when you come to read the article, you find the article has nothing to do with the headline. And we have also this whole notion of equating terrorism with Islam, and that's also trying to reinforce the phrase that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims, even though statistically there's more. There's more, the acts of terrorism that are happening through the world is actually, the Muslims who are committing these acts formulates a small percentage compared to the whole number of acts of terrorism that are happening. So it's definitely a false statement, but you find that this is something that is equated. In 2004, one of the BBC journalists, when she was covering the Indonesian president's speech, so she reported that the new Indonesian president has pledged to deal with corruption, nepotism and Islamic terrorism. So that's how she reported the news, even though he never said the word Islamic terrorism. But she added the word Islamic to the word terrorism just to, again, further equate and make that kind of connection with Muslims. And again, this is something that is quite documented in the news, the media. And also part of the problem as well is that we have underrepresentation of Muslims as journalists, which also obviously happens to also cause part of the issues in terms of this problem. So going back to the impact of the media of this kind of bias, we know that when people are affected by the media and they listen to the news. And they are affected and they formulate their opinions because of that news, this kind of news actually has a negative impact on people, and it basically causes people to have even affected under their subconscious minds that this is the kind of association that is there. So whenever there's the association, that wherever the word terrorism is used, it's used either with associated with the word Muslim or Islamic or whatever, it becomes a negative connotation in the minds of people. It leads to lack of self-confidence on the individual because there's always a conflict between that individual, the kind of message that they're getting at home and the kind of message that's being sold outside. It will therefore affect morality, values. It will affect how people are perceived, and sometimes it will be making them feel ashamed of what kind of identity they have. That will also has an effect on integration, because when individuals always made to feel that they are marginalized, that actually they're not part of this society because they belong to a group that is sort of inherently bad and evil, then that will affect integration and that will prejudice it. There will be a lack of sense of belonging, feeling rejected, and obviously that can also lead to failures in school. So that's very much on an individual level, and we've seen in the UK, even with studies that have been conducted by the Parliament in the UK, how Muslims are suffering from social mobility from all this kind of bias. So Muslims are less likely to get jobs, they are less likely to get high-level administrative jobs. There was a study that was done by, or more of a kind of research done by the BBC, where they did the same CV, but they just changed the name of the applicant. So they changed the applicant from a Muslim name, between Muslim name and non-Muslim names, and they found, so it's the same CV, exact same CV, but just different name, and they found that 33% times less likely for the Muslim to be interviewed because of the name. So just because the person sees there's a Muslim name, does not give that person an interview, even though the CV is the same. So that also affects the chances of getting jobs, and it also affects the people's ability to further participate in society. Now, the consequences and impact on society is also big, because what happens with the impact on society is that we all know that the more you repeat a lie, it becomes a truth in the minds of people. There is a rise of hate crime, and in fact this is something that's also reported in the media. Whenever there is a terrorist attack, the hate crime increases dramatically, as people want to vent their frustration against Muslims, who they associate as being the society that is actually perpetrating this act. Muslim men and boys were killed in one of the biggest genocides since the Holocaust. We saw that the reason building up to that was the dehumanization of the Bosnian Muslims. And this is again something that was documented, and actually it's a stain on Europe's history. Because of continuous dehumanization messages against them, that the Bosnian Serbs had no problem in just massacring people like that. So if we carry on that kind of agenda of making Muslims seem as if they're not part of society, or they're actually not in that way dehumanizing them, then obviously that leads to those kind of that kind of hierarchy in terms of human life and value. There will be a decrease of solidarity, and again that is something that is also a consequence of being marginalized within society, and also we can see that there may be a continuous fear of the other, and lack of therefore any sort of attempts to participate and to promote values in society together and have that kind of cohesive society. I'll just conclude here. So there is negative stereotyping. I think it's well documented that it does affect life. It's no longer something that is questionable, that there is a media bias against Muslims, and that's well documented. While there may be differences as why the media behaves in such a way, whether it's just to sell more newspapers or whether it's about being subject to lobbyist agenda, the reality is that it has impacts on people's lives, and these impacts will obviously become part of a cycle which may cause more problems. So we have a duty to do something, and the duty is that the media has always targeted minorities, and even as I was talking to Mu'min earlier on, that some people say, well, okay, you're talking about media bias against Muslims, what about media bias against other groups within society? And here we're not saying, the title of this talk is not that there doesn't exist any bias against other groups of society. We know that media bias exists against minorities. You know, it's the media always looks for someone to pick on. So, you know, in the past in the UK we had the Irish Catholics were being targeted. In America, the blacks were attacked, and maybe further, and still till today, and so on. The media is always looking for targets, and always looking for people to be associated and to make that bias against them. And so the solution has to be that we as a society are ready to change. Some people say that you Muslims want to remove freedom of media. You don't want the media to express itself. You don't want the right of media, and that's not what we're saying. We are saying that the media should have that protected privilege because that's a right, but they should be reporting in a fair way and a reasonable way. So don't make a title of a headline, or don't report the facts inaccurately, or don't make conclusions of things that are not there. So part of the problem, as you have seen, is sometimes behaving in a way which is not normal. It's just reporting things which are not there, sensationalizing information which doesn't need to be, and that actually adds to the problem. So it's about dealing in a correct way. It's very important that we know that the source of information should not be unilateral, which again, like I mentioned to you before, when most people rely on the media for their information, and we know that if the media is behaving in such a way, then how can it be a source of information? If you want information, you want to learn about the truth, you have to widen your horizons for learning about the information. It's very important that there is a continuous engagement with society. Muslims, in the UK, and I'm sure throughout Europe, they have projects where they are working within society. In the UK, we have projects, for example, called Believe and Do Good, which is a project that occurs in all most of the university Islamic societies, where they actually they have like a whole week of just doing good activities, whether it's charitable activities, feeding the homeless, donating blood, cleaning the streets, whatever. It's about making the belief, your religiosity, part of your contribution to society. We need to make sure that we also do not allow the media to define for us who we are, but rather we should allow our bigger experience of life to allow us to do this. And today, with the explosion of social media and the alternatives that's out there, this is also an avenue for us as non-media people, if I can use that expression, that we can also provide alternatives. So rather than complaining about the media, which I've done all night, we can actually be the media. So we can actually promote and contribute to the media. So today, people have that alternative option to share their information, share the news, whether it's through YouTube or Facebook or the like. We can actually have opportunity to get the truths out there, and I think that's something that we should continue to do. Thank you for listening. I hope that I've clarified some of the important realities of the media, which are unfortunate, but I hope also we have put some important steps and stones into trying to dealing with a problem that unfortunately affects us all. It doesn't just affect Muslims, it affects the whole society, and being parcel of society, we want what's best for society. We want a cohesive, coherent, integrated society which works for the betterment of humanity. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have around 20 to 30 minutes for question and answer session. If you have any question, please raise your hand and ask Dr. El Hamdoon. Okay, maybe I will start the first question because I have something in mind. At the beginning, you gave some examples of news that seems to be kind of biased, but this might be 1 or 2% of the whole information or news posted or published about Muslims. So maybe this is only 1 or 2%, and if you focus on that, this is the same happening with any other minority. So how can we validate if that's the case? Then why are we complaining about it?
Well, I think what I've demonstrated is that there is a disproportionate amount of coverage against Muslims, and that disproportionate, like for example, when Muslims only formulate a small section of society, that the amount of news that's been covered about them should not be too far off that. And I think so, therefore, there is a disproportionate, first of all, in the amount of news that's covered. But also, it's not something that I'm saying, but this is research that showed that actually the amount of news that is being covered about Muslims is in the main negative. So it's very rarely given as a positive piece of news. So, like I said at the end, it's not about the media not covering the news, because that's part of the role of the media, but it just needs to be more fair. And some of the work that we've done in Britain has been challenging news that is inaccurate. because by challenging news that is inaccurate, there is, although it's not the best of regulators, but there is something called the Independent Press Standards Organization. They look at any complaints that are related to inaccuracy in reporting or whatever, and if they find that there is a breach of a conduct, then they will ask the press to amend their story. So we want fairness, we want more accuracy in the news, and you know, if something's out there and they're reporting accurately, then there's nothing to complain about.
Yes.
My name is Arif. If we look at the US situation, what I understand is the issue slightly changed, because what I understand, the media start portraying not only Muslim but also Russia as a kind of enemy of the US.
Yes.
Yeah. In the UK, do you think that happened also, or it's just in the US case the media portraying the Russia as the kind of enemy?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like I also mentioned, is that this title doesn't mean that Muslims are the only targets. Obviously, there are other people who are targeted, and yes, in the UK, Russia is also targeted as for its behaviour in different ways, and it is very frequently reported in a negative light due to it being in a conflict with a lot of the Western policies that are happening, whether they're happening in the Middle East or whether more closer to Europe, like in the Ukraine and so on. So there is that conflict, and Russia is seen and continues to be seen as a threat, and so therefore the media to a certain extent also carries that kind of portrayal, or continues to do that as well.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay, then by that we would like to thank you all for coming, and for sure thank Dr. Hamdoon for his time and all the effort that he did for coming here
Thank you.
and to give the talk here. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.